The threadbare calico dress clung to Zelda Harper's thin frame as she bent over the washboard, scrubbing clothes in the icy creek water outside Westcliff, Colorado. Her knuckles red and raw from the November cold of 1876. She had worn this same dress every day for 3 years, washing it at night and wearing it damp in the mornings when there was no time to let it dry. The fabric had faded from a cheerful blue to a pale gray, and the hem was patched so many times that the patches themselves needed patching. Zelda was 21 years old, though the hardship etched into her features made her appear older in certain lights. She had come to Westcliff 2 years ago after her father died, following a wagon train that promised work in the mining camps. What she found instead was a rough town perched in the wet mountain valley, surrounded by the towering Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where respectable work for a woman alone was scarce, and the winter winds cut through thin fabric like knives through butter. She worked for the Reverend and Mrs. Thompson, cleaning their small church and home in exchange for a cramped room in their attic and 1 meal a day. It was honest work, which was more than many women in her position could claim, but it barely kept her alive. The dress she wore had belonged to her mother, the only thing of value she had managed to keep when creditors seized everything after her father's death. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up from the washboard, water dripping from her reddened hands. A massive figure on horseback emerged from the tree line, leading a pack mule laden with furs. Even from a distance, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse with easy confidence. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen hard use, and a rifle rested across his saddle. Finn Yates had been trapping in the high country for the better part of 6 months, and he was ready for the simple pleasures of civilization. A hot bath, a decent meal, and perhaps some conversation that did not involve talking to his mule. He was 28 years old, built like an oak tree, with arms thick with muscle from setting trap lines and hauling game. His hands were scarred from knives and claws, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his gray eyes were clear and observant. He noticed the woman by the creek immediately. It was impossible not to notice how thin she was, how her dress hung on her frame, how she seemed to fold in on herself when she saw him approaching, as if trying to become invisible. He had seen that look before, on animals that had been mistreated, on people who had learned that strangers meant trouble. Finn guided his horse toward the main street, but his eyes kept drifting back to the creek where the woman had returned to her washing, her movements quick and efficient despite the cold. He hitched his horse outside the general store, and as he unloaded his furs to trade, he found himself thinking about that worn dress, about how the November wind must cut right through such thin fabric. Inside the store, Samuel Winters greeted him with genuine warmth. Finn was known as an honest trapper, and his furs were always prime quality. They negotiated a fair price, and Finn found himself with more money than he had seen in months. He purchased his usual supplies: coffee, flour, salt, ammunition, tobacco. But as he was settling his account, his eyes fell on the bolts of fabric stacked against the far wall. "That woman down by the creek," Finn said, his voice rough from disuse. "She worked for the church," Samuel nodded. "That would be Miss Harper. Came here a couple years back, fallen on hard times. The Reverend and his wife give her work, though between you and me, I do not think they treat her as well as Christian charity would suggest they should." Finn grunted, still looking at the fabric. There was a deep blue cotton that reminded him of mountain lakes in summer, a warm brown wool that would stand up to winter, and a green calico with small flowers that seemed cheerful despite the drab surroundings of the store. "How much fabric would it take to make a dress?" he asked. Samuel raised his eyebrows but did not comment on the unusual question. "For a woman of average size, I would say 4 yards should do it. 5 if you want to be sure of having enough. You planning on taking up dressmaking, Finn?" "Maybe I am," Finn said. "Give me 5 yards of that blue cotton, 5 yards of the brown wool, and 5 yards of the green calico." Samuel cut the fabric carefully, folding each piece and wrapping it in brown paper. Finn paid without haggling, though the cost was considerable. As he loaded his purchases onto his mule, he realized he had no idea how to actually make a dress. The fabric was useless without that knowledge. He stood in the street for a long moment, feeling foolish. What had possessed him to buy dress fabric for a woman he did not even know? He could return it, get his money back, head back to his cabin in the mountains and forget about the thin woman in the faded dress. That would be the sensible thing to do. Instead, he found himself walking toward the church, his long strides eating up the distance. The woman was hanging laundry now, stretching on her toes to reach the line, and he could see that her shoes were as worn as her dress, the soles coming loose at the toes. "Excuse me, miss," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. Zelda jumped, nearly dropping the shirt she was hanging. She turned to face him, and he saw fear flicker across her features before she schooled them into careful neutrality. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, with light brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and hazel eyes that held both wariness and intelligence. "Yes, sir." Her voice was soft, careful. "I am Finn Yates. I just came down from the high country and I find myself in need of some information." He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how large he was, how frightening he might appear to someone as small as she was. "I purchased some fabric, thinking to make some items, but I realize I do not know the first thing about sewing. I was wondering if you might be willing to teach me in exchange for payment, of course." Zelda blinked, confusion replacing the wariness. "You want to learn to sew?" "Yes, madam." "But surely there are women in town who could sew for you, whatever it is you need. Mrs. Patterson takes in sewing, and she does fine work." Finn shook his head. "I am not looking to hire someone to sew. I want to learn to do it myself. A man should be able to mend his own things, seems to me, and I have time this winter before I head back up to the mountains." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. Mountain men mended their buckskins with leather thongs and sinew, not needle and thread. But Zelda saw something in his eyes, a straightforward honesty that made her think he was not trying to trick her or trap her into something unseemly. "I could teach you the basics," she said slowly. "Though I am not sure I am the best teacher. I only know what my mother taught me before she passed." "That is more than I know," Finn said. "Would you have time this afternoon? I could pay you $2 for the lesson." $2. Zelda's heart raced. $2 was more than she made in a month from the Thompsons. With $2, she could buy soap, real soap, and perhaps some ribbon to repair her one good bonnet. But she hesitated, years of hardship making her cautious. "I would need to ask the Reverend and Mrs. Thompson," she said. "They expect me to complete my duties here first." "Of course." "I will be at the boarding house if you are able to come. Room 7. He tipped his hat to her and walked away, leaving Zelda staring after him with her heart pounding. She had spoken to trappers and mountain men before, rough characters who came to town to trade their furs and spend their earnings on whiskey and women. But there had been something different about Finn Yates, something in the way he had kept his distance, the way he had called her madam as if she were a respectable woman instead of a charity case living in a church attic. Mrs. Thompson was less than pleased when Zelda asked permission to give a sewing lesson. A sewing lesson. The older woman's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. Since when do mountain men care about learning to sew? This sounds highly improper, Zelda. What would people think? You going alone to a man's room at the boarding house. He offered to pay $2. Madam, Zelda said quietly. And we could conduct the lesson in the boarding house parlor, where it would be entirely proper and in full view of others. Mrs. Thompson's eyes glittered at the mention of money. $2 is a considerable sum. I suppose it would be acceptable, provided you conduct yourself with absolute propriety and return here immediately after to complete your evening duties. And I expect you to contribute $1 to the household as partial repayment for the charity we have extended to you. Zelda's heart sank, but she nodded. $1 was still more than she usually had. Yes, madam. Thank you, madam. An hour later, she knocked on the door to the boarding house parlor, where Finn had arranged for them to meet. He had bathed and changed into clean clothes, though they were still the rough wool and cotton of a working man. His hair was tied back, and she could see his face clearly now, the strong jaw beneath the beard, the sharp intelligence in his gray eyes. He stood when she entered, and she realized just how tall he was, how his shoulders filled the doorway, how his arms strained against the fabric of his shirt. Everything about him spoke of strength, of a man who had carved his living from the wilderness through sheer determination and physical power. Miss Harper, he said, gesturing to the table where he had laid out the wrapped packages of fabric. Thank you for coming. Please sit down. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, and watched as he unwrapped the fabric. Her eyes widened when she saw the quality, the quantity, the beautiful colors. "This is what you purchased?" she asked, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "Yes, I hope I got enough." The storekeeper said 5 yards of each should be sufficient. Sufficient for what, if I may ask? Finn met her eyes steadily. Dresses. 3 dresses. The room fell silent. Zelda stared at him, her mind racing. 3 dresses worth of fabric, 5 yards of each. Expensive fabric, good fabric, fabric she could never afford in a lifetime of working for the Thompsons. "Mr. Yates," she said carefully, "I am not sure I understand." "It seems simple enough to me," he said. "You only have 1 dress. A woman should have more than 1 dress." "I have the fabric, but I do not have the skill to make it into dresses. You have the skill, but not the fabric. We could help each other." "You bought this fabric for me." She could barely breathe. "I did." "But why? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Finn was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I have spent most of my life in the mountains, Miss Harper. I have seen hard winters and lean times. I have seen what it looks like when a living creature is barely holding on, doing everything it can just to survive another day. When I saw you this morning, washing clothes in that freezing creek in a dress that cannot possibly keep you warm, I recognized that look. And I found that I could not ride away and do nothing when I had the means to help." Tears pricked at Zelda's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had learned not to cry, had learned that tears solved nothing and often made things worse. "That is very kind, Mr. Yates, but I cannot accept charity. I will not be beholden to any man." "It is not charity," Finn said firmly. "I truly do want to learn to sew. And in exchange for your teaching, you keep the dresses you make. That is a fair trade, seems to me. You want to learn to sew 3 entire dresses, however long it takes. I have time, and I am a patient man." Zelda looked down at the fabric, running her fingers over the soft cotton, the sturdy wool, the cheerful calico. 3 dresses. She could have a dress for every day, a warm dress for winter, a pretty dress for Sundays. She could wash one and wear another. She could stop washing her dress at night and wearing it damp in the mornings. "I do not understand why you are doing this," she whispered. "Does there need to be more reason than it is the right thing to do?" She looked up at him, searching his face for deception, for hidden motives, for the cruel twist that she had learned to expect from life. But she saw only honesty, only a straightforward desire to help without strings attached. "If I am to teach you properly," she said slowly, "we will need to start with the basics. Needles, thread, scissors, pins, a measuring tape. Do you have these things?" "I have needles and thread for mending, but not the rest. We can go to the general store now if you are willing." They walked to the store together, and Zelda found herself acutely aware of the looks they received from townspeople. A respectable woman did not walk with a mountain man, did not spend time alone with a man who was not her husband or relation. But Finn seemed oblivious to the stares, and his solid presence beside her made her feel safer than she had in years. At the store, she selected what they would need, and Finn paid without question. She tried to choose the least expensive options, but he insisted on quality materials. "If I am learning to do something, I want to do it right," he said. "No sense in saving pennies just to make the job harder." Back at the boarding house parlor, Zelda began the first lesson. She showed him how to thread a needle, how to make small, even stitches, how to knot the thread so it would not pull through. His hands were large and scarred, built for handling rifles and skinning knives, not delicate needlework. But he was patient and determined, practicing the same stitch over and over until he could do it smoothly. "You are a quick learner," Zelda said, surprised at his progress. "I have learned that anything worth doing requires practice and attention," Finn replied, concentrating on keeping his stitches even. "Whether it is shooting straight, reading tracks, or sewing a seam." They worked until the light began to fade, and Zelda realized with a start that hours had passed. She had been so focused on teaching, so absorbed in the pleasure of working with beautiful fabric and having someone truly listen to her instructions, that she had forgotten to be afraid, forgotten to be cautious. "I should return to the church," she said reluctantly. "Mrs. Thompson will be expecting me." Finn set down his sewing and pulled $2 from his pocket. "For today's lesson, same time tomorrow, I will ask permission," Zelda said, closing her fingers around the coins. "Thank you, Mr. Yates, for everything." "Finn," he said, "just Finn." "And it is I who should thank you. You are a fine teacher." Zelda hurried back to the church, her mind whirling. She gave Mrs. Thompson $1 as promised and hid the other in the small wooden box where she kept her few possessions. That night, lying in her narrow attic bed, she could not sleep for thinking about the fabric, the colors, the possibility of having more than one dress. And if she also thought about Finn Yates, about the kindness in his gray eyes and the patience in his scarred hands, well, that was something she kept to herself. The lessons continued daily for a week. Each afternoon, Zelda would complete her morning duties at the church, then walk to the boarding house where Finn waited in the parlor. Under her guidance, he learned to cut fabric according to a pattern, to pin pieces together, to sew straight seams and set sleeves. His hands grew more confident with the needle, and though his stitches would never be as fine as hers, they were strong and serviceable. They talked as they worked. Finn told her about life in the mountains, about tracking elk through deep snow and watching the sun rise over granite peaks. He told her about the peace of the high country, the silence broken only by wind through pine trees and the calls of ravens. He did not tell her about the loneliness, but she heard it anyway, in the spaces between his words. Zelda told him about her life before Westcliff, about growing up on a small farm in Kansas, about her mother teaching her to sew, and her father reading aloud from books in the evenings. She told him about the fever that took her mother, the drought that killed the crops, the debts that piled up until there was nothing left but to sell everything and try to start over. She did not tell him about the hunger, about the nights she cried herself to sleep in the church attic, but he heard it anyway, in the careful way she rationed her words as if even speech was something that must be conserved. On the 8th day, as they worked on the bodice of the first dress, the blue cotton that reminded Finn of summer lakes, Mrs. Thompson appeared in the parlor doorway. "Zelda," she said sharply. "A word, please." Zelda's face went pale. She set down her sewing and followed Mrs. Thompson into the hallway, but Finn could hear every word through the thin walls. "This has gone on quite long enough," Mrs. Thompson said. "People are talking. They are saying you spend your afternoons alone with a mountain man doing heaven knows what. It reflects poorly on the church, and by extension on my husband and myself. I forbid you to continue these lessons." "But Mrs. Thompson, we are always in the parlor in full view of anyone who passes. There is nothing improper about it." "The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as impropriety itself. You will not go again. That is final." "I understand, madam." Zelda's voice was barely a whisper. She returned to the parlor, and Finn could see she was fighting tears. "I apologize, Finn, but I cannot continue the lessons. Mrs. Thompson has forbidden it." Finn set down the bodice he had been working on, his jaw tight with anger he was careful to keep from his voice. "I see. That is her right, I suppose, as your employer. I am sorry. I know you paid for all this fabric, and now it will go to waste." "The fabric is yours, no matter what. I will have it sent to the church. I cannot sew it myself without permission to use my time for personal projects. Mrs. Thompson considers all my time to belong to the household." The words came out bitter, and Zelda looked shocked at her own tone. Finn stood, his mind working through the problem. "Miss Harper, may I ask you a question of a personal nature?" She nodded warily. "Are you happy working for the Thompsons?" The question seemed to surprise her. "I have food and shelter. That is more than many can say." "That is not what I asked." Zelda looked down at her hands, at the calluses and rough skin, at the dress that was more patch than original fabric. "No," she said quietly. "I am not happy." "The hotel needs a cook," Finn said. "I spoke with the owner yesterday. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. He said he has been looking for someone reliable for weeks now." $30, Zelda stared at him. "But I have no experience cooking for a hotel. Can you cook?" "Yes, but only simple things. Farm food." "That is what the hotel serves, simple, filling meals for working men." "I think you could do it, if you wanted to try." "Why would the hotel owner hire me? I have no references except from the Thompsons, and I doubt they would give me a good one if I left their employment." Finn smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered features. "I have been staying at that hotel for a week now. The owner, Jack Morrison, asked me if I knew anyone who might be suitable for the position. I told him about you, about how you are hardworking and honest and deserving of a better situation than you currently have. He said he would be willing to meet with you, and if you can cook him a decent meal, the job is yours." Zelda sat down abruptly, her legs suddenly weak. "You did that for me. Why?" "Because you deserve better than to spend your life working for people who treat you as less than you are," Finn said simply. "Because you are smart and capable, and you should have the chance to build a life of your own choosing. And because I would like to continue our sewing lessons if you are willing, and that cannot happen while the Thompsons control your time. I do not know what to say. Say you will meet with Jack Morrison. Say you will at least consider the possibility that your life could be different than it is now." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw hope in her eyes instead of just wary resignation. "I will meet with him." "When?" "This evening, if you are able. He takes his supper at 6 o'clock. If you could prepare it for him, he said that would serve as your interview." That evening, Zelda stood in the hotel kitchen, more nervous than she had ever been in her life. Jack Morrison was a gruff man in his 50s, with a limp from an old mining accident and a shrewd eye for character. He showed her the kitchen, the larder, the supplies she would have to work with. "Nothing fancy," he said. "The men who stay here work hard and they want food that sticks to their ribs. Beef, potatoes, beans, bread. Can you manage that?" "Yes, sir." "Then get to it. I will be in the dining room when you are ready." Zelda rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She had learned to cook from her mother, who had believed that food was an expression of care, that even simple ingredients could be transformed into something nourishing and good if prepared with attention and skill. She made a beef stew with onions and carrots, biscuits from scratch, and a dried apple pie with the last of the season's apples. When she carried the meal to Jack Morrison, her hands were shaking. He ate slowly, methodically, his expression revealing nothing. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and looked at her directly. "That is the best meal I have had in this hotel in 2 years," he said. "The job is yours if you want it. $30 a month, room on the second floor, meals included. You cook breakfast, dinner, and supper for however many guests we have, usually between 10 and 20 men. You keep the kitchen clean and manage the supplies. I order what you need, but you are responsible for making sure we do not run out of staples. 1 day off per week. Do we have an agreement?" "Yes, sir," Zelda said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We have an agreement. When can you start?" "I will need to give notice to the Thompsons. 'A week, perhaps," Jack nodded. "A week, then. I look forward to having decent food again, Miss Harper." Telling the Thompsons was harder than the interview had been. Mrs. Thompson was furious, insisting that Zelda was ungrateful, that she would never find better employment, that she was throwing away their kindness for the sake of pride. The Reverend said little, but his disapproval was clear in every line of his face. Zelda endured their recriminations with her head held high, and when she walked out of the church for the last time, carrying her few possessions in a worn canvas bag, she felt lighter than she had in years. The threadbare dress still hung on her frame, but she knew it would not be her only dress for much longer. Finn helped her move into the hotel, carrying her bag up the stairs to the small but clean room that would be hers. It had a real bed with a quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a mirror, and a window that looked out over the main street. To Zelda, it was a palace. "Thank you," she said to Finn, and there was a world of meaning in those 2 words. "You earned this yourself," he said. I just pointed the way. "Will we continue the sewing lessons?" she asked, suddenly shy, "if you still have time for a clumsy student." "You are not clumsy. Your stitches have improved remarkably." They resumed their lessons the next day, working in the hotel parlor now instead of the boarding house. Finn had moved to the hotel as well, claiming the food was better, though they both knew he could have returned to his mountain cabin weeks ago. The blue dress took shape under their combined efforts, and though Finn did much of the basic sewing, Zelda handled the more intricate work, the buttonholes and hems and finishing touches that required a delicate hand. When the dress was finished, Finn insisted she try it on to ensure the fit was correct. Zelda changed in her room, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The blue cotton fit her perfectly, nipping in at the waist and draping gracefully over her hips. The color brought out the gold in her hazel eyes and made her skin glow. She returned to the parlor, suddenly self-conscious, and found Finn standing by the window. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was no flattery in his voice, only honest appreciation. "The dress is beautiful," Zelda corrected, blushing. "You did fine work on the seams." "I had a good teacher." They started on the second dress, the brown wool that would keep her warm through the Colorado winter. The work went faster now that Finn had mastered the basic techniques. As they sewed, they continued to talk, and the conversations grew deeper, more personal. Finn told her about his childhood in Ohio, about parents who died when he was 16, about drifting west because there was nothing to hold him in the east. He told her about learning to trap from an old French Canadian who took pity on a greenhorn kid with more determination than sense. He told her about finding the mountains, about the first time he had stood on a high ridge and looked out over an endless expanse of peaks and valleys, and feeling like he had finally found where he belonged. Zelda told him about her dreams, the ones she had almost forgotten about in the daily struggle to survive. She told him about wanting to have a home of her own someday, a place where she could plant a garden and raise chickens and maybe, if she was very fortunate, have a family. She told him about missing her parents every day, about wishing they could have seen her working at the hotel, earning her own way, building a life with her own hands. As the weeks passed, their friendship deepened into something neither of them was quite ready to name. Finn found excuses to linger in the hotel kitchen after supper, watching Zelda work, admiring the efficient grace with which she moved. Zelda found herself watching for Finn in the dining room, her heart lifting when she saw him come in for meals, her eyes seeking him out even when she was busy serving other guests. It was December now, and snow covered the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, turning the peaks blindingly white against the blue sky. Christmas was approaching, and the town of Westcliff had a festive air despite the cold. Finn and Zelda had finished the second dress and started on the third, the green calico with its cheerful flower pattern. One evening, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, Finn asked Zelda to take a walk with him. She agreed, bundling herself in a shawl, though she longed to wear the new brown wool dress instead of the old faded calico. The brown dress was too fine for everyday work in the kitchen, and she was saving it for special occasions. They walked down the main street, their breath fogging in the cold air. Finn was quiet, and Zelda could sense he was working up to saying something important. "Miss Harper," he began, then stopped. "Zelda, may I call you Zelda, of course, and I would like to call you Finn if I may." "I would like that." He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you will hear me out before you respond." Zelda's heart began to pound, but she kept her voice calm. "I am listening. When I first came down from the mountains this fall, I was planning to stay in town just long enough to sell my furs and buy supplies. I had no intention of remaining for 2 months. I have a cabin up in the high country where I spend my winters, trapping and living off the land. It is a solitary life, but it has always been enough for me." He paused, and Zelda waited, her hands clenched in the folds of her shawl. "But then I met you," Finn continued, "and everything changed. I find that I do not want to return to the mountains alone. I find that the thought of that cabin, which has always been my refuge, now seems empty and cold without you in it." Zelda's breath caught, but Finn pressed on. "I know I have no right to ask this. I know I am just a rough mountain man with nothing to offer but a hard life in a remote cabin. But I have come to care for you deeply, Zelda. More than deeply. I love you, and if there is any chance that you might feel the same way about me, I would like to ask you to marry me." Zelda stopped walking, turning to face him fully. In the lamplight from the nearby buildings, she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she would reject him. "You love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "with everything I am. But you barely know me. I know that you are strong and kind and brave. I know that you have endured hardship that would have broken a lesser person, and you have not let it make you bitter or cruel. I know that when I am with you, I feel more at peace than I have ever felt in the mountains. I know that you make me want to be a better man than I am." Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since you bought that fabric, since you took the time to learn to sew just to give me dresses. Since you saw me as worthy of kindness when I had forgotten that I was." Finn pulled her into his arms, and she felt the solid strength of him, the warmth that radiated from his massive frame. He held her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break, and she realized that she felt safe in a way she had not felt since her father died. "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, looking up at him with a smile that lit her whole face. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, a gentle kiss that promised protection and partnership and a future built together. When they finally pulled apart, both were grinning like fools, giddy with the sudden certainty that they had found something rare and worth holding on to. They were married 2 weeks later, just after Christmas, in a simple ceremony at the small Catholic church on the edge of town. Jack Morrison stood up as Finn's witness, and the hotel's housekeeper, a kind woman named Margaret, stood up for Zelda. Zelda wore the green calico dress, the last one they had made together, and she carried a bouquet of pine branches and dried flowers. The priest who married them was ancient and mostly deaf, but his blessing was heartfelt. When he pronounced them man and wife, Finn kissed his bride with a tenderness that made Margaret dab at her eyes with her handkerchief. They had a small celebration dinner at the hotel, and Jack Morrison gifted them a week of privacy in the best room, refusing to accept payment despite Finn's protests. That night, as Zelda stood in the room she would share with her new husband, wearing the blue cotton dress and feeling nervous and excited in equal measure, Finn took her hands in his. "I want you to know," he said, "that I will always take care of you. You will never again have to wear a dress until it is nothing but patches and threads. You will never again have to go hungry or cold or afraid. I promise you this on my life." "I know," Zelda said, and she did know. Finn Yates was a man who kept his promises. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and perfect. Two people learning each other in the lamplight, discovering the ways their bodies fit together. Finn was patient, and Zelda was brave, and by the time the winter dawn crept through the windows, they both knew they had made the right choice. They stayed in Westcliff through the winter. Finn had planned to take Zelda to his mountain cabin right after the wedding, but a series of blizzards made travel impossible. Instead, they rented a small house at the edge of town, a 2-room cabin that was cozy and private. Zelda continued to work at the hotel through the winter, though now she worked only breakfast and dinner, leaving her afternoons free. Finn took odd jobs around town, using his strength and skills to help with repairs and heavy lifting. In the evenings, they would sit by their fire, and Zelda would sew while Finn read aloud from books borrowed from the general store. It was a peaceful, happy time. Zelda bloomed under the steady diet of good food and love, her face filling out, her eyes losing the hunted look that had haunted them when Finn first met her. She still had only 3 dresses, but they were clean and well made in hers, and that made all the difference. Finn, for his part, was amazed by the simple pleasures of domestic life. He had spent so many years alone that he had forgotten what it was like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who cared about his stories and shared her own in return. He found that he did not miss the solitude of the mountains as much as he had expected. Home, he discovered, was not a place but a person. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire, Zelda set down her sewing and looked at Finn seriously. "I need to tell you something," she said. Finn looked up from his book, concern flickering across his features. "What is it?" I am with child. The baby should come in early September if my calculations are correct. For a moment, Finn was silent and Zelda felt a spike of fear. But then he set down his book and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Zelda asked, even though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy does not begin to cover it. I am overwhelmed. I am terrified. I am more grateful than I knew it was possible to be." He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you happy?" "More than I have ever been in my life." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. They would stay in Westcliff through the summer, so Zelda would have access to the doctor when her time came. After the baby was born and she had recovered, they would decide whether to stay in town or move to the mountain cabin. Finn was willing to do whatever Zelda preferred, though he secretly hoped she would want to try life in the mountains. He wanted to show her the places he loved, wanted to share that part of himself with her and their child. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Zelda's pregnancy became obvious. She had to stop working at the hotel, but Jack Morrison insisted on paying her anyway, calling it a bonus for the months of good cooking she had provided. The money was a blessing, allowing them to purchase baby clothes and supplies. Finn, who had learned to sew dresses, now learned to sew tiny gowns and blankets. His large hands worked carefully on the delicate baby clothes, and Zelda fell in love with him all over again, watching him struggle to make stitches small enough for an infant. One afternoon in April, a woman arrived at their cabin door. She was in her early 30s, well-dressed and confident, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Mrs. Yates," she said when Zelda opened the door. "My name is Catherine Morris. I am a midwife, and I recently moved to Westcliff from Denver. Mr. Morrison at the hotel told me you are expecting a baby, and I wanted to introduce myself and offer my services." Zelda invited her in, grateful for the appearance of an experienced woman. The town doctor was competent but gruff, and Zelda had been anxious about the birth. Catherine examined her gently and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. "You are doing everything right," she said. "Good food, moderate exercise, plenty of rest. The baby should come in September as you calculated. I will check on you regularly, and when your time comes, send for me and I will be there." Zelda felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Having Catherine's expertise and reassurance made the prospect of giving birth less frightening. Summer arrived, hot and dry. Zelda grew larger, her dresses straining at the seams. Finn let them out carefully, adding panels of fabric to accommodate her changing shape. She could no longer wear the corset that was standard for women of the time, and she did not care. Comfort was more important than fashion. One evening in late August, as they sat on their small porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Zelda said, "I want to go to the cabin. After the baby is born and I have recovered, I want to see the place you love so much." Finn reached over and took her hand. "Are you sure? It is a hard life up there. No neighbors, no town nearby. If something goes wrong, we would be on our own." "I am sure. I spent too much of my life being afraid, Finn. I do not want to be afraid anymore. I want to see the mountains. I want our child to grow up knowing wild places and open spaces. And I want to be wherever you are." "Then we will go," Finn said, "as soon as you are strong enough to travel." The baby came on the first day of September, just as Catherine had predicted. Labor started in the early morning, and by evening, after hours of pain and effort that tested Zelda's strength to its limit, their son was born. He was red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Finn held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his weathered face, his massive hands cradling the tiny body with infinite gentleness. "He is perfect," he whispered. Absolutely perfect. They named him Thomas after Zelda's father, Thomas Harper Yates. He was a healthy baby with strong lungs and a healthy appetite, and both his parents fell completely in love with him from the first moment. Catherine stayed with them for the first few days, teaching Zelda how to nurse and care for the baby, making sure she recovered properly from the birth. When she finally left, she hugged Zelda warmly. "You did beautifully," she said. "You are stronger than you know. If you need anything, anything at all, send for me." For the first few weeks, life revolved entirely around the baby. Zelda was exhausted and sore, and Finn took over all the household duties, cooking and cleaning and doing laundry while also caring for both his wife and son. He had never imagined himself as a father, had never thought he would be good at it, but he found that it came naturally when it was his own child, his own family. By October, Zelda had recovered her strength, and Thomas was thriving. The aspens on the mountains had turned gold, and the air had the sharp clarity that comes with autumn. It was time to make a decision about their future. "I want to try the cabin," Zelda said one morning as she nursed Thomas. "Just for the winter. If I cannot manage it, if it is too hard or too lonely, we can come back to town in the spring. But I want to try." Finn nodded slowly. "It will not be easy. The cabin is small and it gets very cold. We will be snowed in for weeks at a time. If anything goes wrong, we cannot just send for the doctor." "I know, but we will be together, the three of us. That is what matters." They spent the next few weeks preparing. Finn purchased supplies in quantities he had never needed when he was alone. Extra flour and sugar, dried beans and salt pork, coffee and tea. He bought fabric so Zelda could sew clothes for Thomas as he grew. He bought more ammunition and made sure his traps were in good repair. They said goodbye to Jack Morrison and Catherine Morris and the few other people they had befriended in Westcliff. Jack made them promise to return in the spring, and Catherine gave Zelda a bag of herbs and medicines, along with detailed instructions on what to do if Thomas got sick or injured. The journey to the cabin took 3 days. Finn had a horse for himself and one for Zelda, and he had rigged a sling so she could carry Thomas close to her chest while riding. They also had 2 pack mules loaded with supplies. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, following game paths and creek beds, passing through forests of pine and aspen, crossing meadows where elk grazed in the golden afternoon light. Zelda had never been so far from civilization, had never seen country so wild and beautiful. Despite the difficulty of the journey, despite being sore from riding and worried about Thomas, she felt a sense of wonder that made her eyes shine. On the 3rd day, they reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range rising dramatically behind it. The cabin was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. There was a small barn for the horses and mules, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. Finn helped Zelda down from her horse, watching her face anxiously as she looked around. "It is not much," he said, "but it is weatherproof and the roof does not leak." "It is wonderful," Zelda said, and she meant it. The cabin might be small, but it was sturdy and well made, clearly the work of a man who knew how to build something to last. And the setting was breathtaking, surrounded by wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside, the cabin was a single room with a sleeping loft above. There was a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and a bed frame that Finn had built himself. Shelves lined the walls and pegs for hanging clothes and gear. A ladder led up to the loft. It was sparse but clean, and Zelda could immediately see how she could make it into a home. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. Finn checked his trap lines every few days, bringing back beaver and fox and marten. He hunted elk and deer, hanging the meat to cure, storing it in the root cellar where it would stay frozen through the winter. He chopped enormous amounts of firewood, stacking it under the porch where it would stay dry. Zelda kept the cabin clean and warm, cooked meals from their supplies, and cared for Thomas. She sewed clothes for all of them, mending and patching and creating. She learned to cure the pelts that Finn brought back, scraping and stretching them according to his patient instructions. She discovered that she was stronger than she had believed, that she could adapt to this hard life, that she could even find joy in it. The winter was long and harsh. Snow fell for days at a time, piling up until it reached the windows. The temperature dropped so low that water left outside froze solid in minutes. There were weeks when they did not see another human soul, when the world consisted only of the cabin, the clearing, and the endless white expanse of snow. But they were warm and well-fed, and they had each other. Finn had never been happier, coming home from checking his trap lines to find Zelda cooking supper and Thomas playing on a blanket by the fire. Zelda had never felt more secure, more valued, more loved. She would look up from her sewing to see Finn sitting in his chair with Thomas in his arms, reading aloud from one of their precious books, and feel her heart overflow with gratitude for this life she had found. Thomas thrived in the mountains. He was a happy baby, quick to smile, fascinated by everything around him. When he was old enough, Finn would carry him outside to show him the tracks of animals in the snow, teaching him the names of trees and birds, introducing him to the wilderness that was his birthright. One evening in January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Finn pulled out a package wrapped in cloth. "I made something for you," he said, handing it to Zelda. She unwrapped it to find a dress, carefully sewn from soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of blue and green. It was beautiful, the work of many hours, and she realized he must have been working on it in secret. "Finn," she breathed, "this is extraordinary. When did you make this?" "While you were sleeping. I wanted to make you something special, something that would last. The beads I traded for at the store last fall, and I asked an Ute woman to teach me the patterns. It took me a while to get it right." Zelda held the dress against herself, marveling at the fit, the quality of the workmanship. "You have become quite the seamstress," she said with a teasing smile. "I had a good teacher," Finn replied. "Do you like it?" "I love it. But more than the dress, I love that you made it for me. I love that you took the time to learn beadwork just to make me something beautiful." She set the dress aside and moved to sit in his lap, Thomas already asleep in the cradle Finn had made. "I love you, Finn Yates, more than I have words to express." "I love you too," he said, holding her close. "You and Thomas are my whole world. Everything I do, everything I am is for you." They kissed, and the fire crackled, and outside the snow continued to fall. But inside the cabin was warmth and love and a happiness that neither of them had dared to hope for when they were alone. Spring came slowly to the high country. The snow melted reluctantly, revealing brown grass and muddy trails. The creek, which had been frozen solid for months, began to flow again, its sound a constant background music to their days. Birds returned, their songs filling the forest. Wildflowers pushed up through the last patches of snow, splashing the meadows with color. Finn and Zelda decided to stay in the mountains rather than return to Westcliff. They had everything they needed here, and the isolation that might have driven others mad felt like freedom to them. They were building a life together, a life of their own choosing, and neither of them wanted to give that up. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter was born the following winter, a tiny girl with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's determination. They named her Anna, after Zelda's mother. 2 years later, another son arrived, whom they named Samuel. The cabin felt full and lively, with children's laughter and the constant activity of family life. Finn expanded the cabin, building on an additional room and improving the loft so the children would have their own space as they grew. He taught Thomas to track and hunt, passing on the skills that had kept him alive for so many years. Zelda taught Anna to sew and cook, sharing the knowledge her own mother had given her. They made trips to Westcliff twice a year in spring and fall to sell furs and buy supplies and visit with friends. Jack Morrison was always delighted to see them, and Catherine Morris loved catching up with the family and checking on the children. But they were always eager to return to the mountains, to the cabin that had become home. Zelda never forgot what her life had been before Finn found her by that creek in her one faded dress. She never took for granted the abundance she now enjoyed, the closeness of her family, the security of knowing she was loved and valued. She made sure her children understood the importance of kindness, of helping those who had less, of never judging someone by their circumstances. And she never stopped marveling at the fact that Finn had learned to sew just to give her dresses, that he had seen her worth when she had almost forgotten she had any. It was the thing she told people about when they asked how she and Finn had met, the story that never failed to make her smile. Finn, for his part, never regretted leaving his solitary life for the chaos and joy of family. He had thought he was content alone in the mountains, but he had not known what contentment really meant until he had Zelda beside him and children calling him Papa. Every night, as he lay beside his wife in the bed he had built with his own hands, listening to the breathing of his children in the loft above, he gave thanks for the impulse that had made him buy that fabric all those years ago. The years turned into decades. Thomas grew into a man as strong and capable as his father, eventually marrying a rancher's daughter from the valley, and building his own cabin a few miles from his parents. Anna became a skilled seamstress, her work in demand throughout the region, and married a young schoolteacher who settled in Westcliff. Samuel, the youngest, proved to have an aptitude for business and eventually opened a mercantile in town, though he never lost his love for the mountains. Finn and Zelda grew old together in the cabin, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by years of shared experience, by the challenges they had overcome together, by the life they had built from nothing but determination and hope. One evening in late autumn, when they were both in their 60s, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The aspens were turning, splashing the hillsides with yellow, and the air had the sharp clarity that promised winter. "You ever regret it?" Finn asked, his hand holding hers. "Leaving town, living up here all these years?" "Never," Zelda said firmly. "This has been the best life I could have imagined, better than I could have imagined because I never thought I deserved this kind of happiness." "You deserved it more than anyone I have ever known." "We deserved it," Zelda corrected. "Both of us. We found each other when we needed each other most, and we built something beautiful together." Finn raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Do you remember the first day I saw you?" "At the creek, washing clothes. I was wearing that horrible faded dress that was more patch than fabric. You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I knew right then that my life was about to change, though I did not know how. And do you remember teaching you to sew? How frustrated you got with the thread. I remember thinking I would never master something so delicate, but I kept trying because I wanted to give you something you needed, something you could not get for yourself. You gave me so much more than dresses, Finn. You gave me back my life. You gave me hope when I had forgotten what hope felt like. You gave me love and respect and a home. You gave me the same things, Finn said quietly. I was so lonely before I met you, Zelda. I did not even realize how lonely I was until I had you to come home to. You made me understand what it means to truly live instead of just survive. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank behind the peaks, the shadows lengthening across the clearing. Inside the cabin, the fire was laid and ready to light. The lamp oil was filled. The beds were made with quilts Zelda had sewn over the years. Everything was in its place, the result of decades of careful tending, of two people working together to build a life. I want you to know, Zelda said, that if I could go back and live my life over, I would not change a single thing. Not the hardship, not the struggle, not even that terrible time working for the Thompsons. Because all of it led me to you, and you have been worth everything I endured to find you. Finn pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, fitting against him as naturally as she had for the past 40 years. I feel the same way, he said. Every choice I made, every path I took brought me to that moment by the creek when I saw you. And from that moment on, everything has been better than I deserved. We both deserved happiness, Zelda said firmly, and we found it together. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, countless points of light in the vast mountain sky. The creek murmured its endless song, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The cabin behind them was warm and welcoming, filled with the memories of a lifetime, the evidence of a love that had transformed two lonely people into a family, into a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Finn and Zelda Yates lived out their remaining years in the cabin they loved, surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited often and cherished every moment with them. When Finn finally passed away at the age of 73, Zelda held his hand and told him she loved him one last time, watching as the man who had given her 3 dresses and a lifetime of love slipped peacefully away. She followed him 2 years later, on a spring morning when the meadow was full of wildflowers and the creek ran clear and cold with snowmelt. Her children found her in the rocking chair on the porch, a quilt she had been mending in her lap, a smile on her face as if she had seen something wonderful just before she left. They buried her beside Finn in the small cemetery on the hill above the cabin, where they could look out over the mountains they had both loved so much. And in the cabin, carefully preserved, hung 3 dresses, 1 blue cotton, 1 brown wool, and 1 green calico, each sewn with love by a mountain man who learned to sew so that the woman he would come to love would never again have to own only 1 dress. The story of Finn and Zelda Yates became a legend in the Wet Mountain Valley, told and retold by their descendants and by the people who had known them. It was a story about kindness and transformation, about seeing worth in another person when the world had taught them they had none. It was a story about practical love, the kind that shows itself in actions rather than words, in time spent learning difficult skills just to make someone's life a little easier. But most of all, it was a story about 2 people who found each other when they were lost, who built a life together from nothing but determination and hope and love, who proved that even the hardest circumstances could be transformed into something beautiful if you had the right person beside you. And somewhere in the mountains, in a cabin by a creek where aspens turn gold in autumn and wildflowers bloom in spring, that love lives on, woven into every log and stone, present in every sunset and starlit night, as permanent and enduring as the mountains themselves.